Welcome to The Conversation, where we dive deep into the issues that matter most. I'm your host, Kwame Thomas, and tonight we have two special guests to discuss the legacy of Dr. Nigel Clarke as Finance Minister of Jamaica and his upcoming role as Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Joining me tonight are Mr. Chen, a prominent Jamaican businessman and social commentator, as well as David Mullins, a former representative of the USA on the Jamaica Diaspora Advisory Board, who will be joining us a little later. Stay tuned to this conversation. So, welcome to the conversation, Mr. Chen. How are you?
Very well.
So, I just want to get right in the middle of the ball game as soon as we possibly can. We see some big changes happening on the local political landscape that will have implications, no doubt, globally, but more so for the Caribbean. We see the recent appointment of our own finance minister, Nigel Clarke, Dr. Nigel Clarke. It's a big deal. He is the first person from Central America and the Caribbean region to have gotten that appointment. He's now managing director, or deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. What are some of those implications? Secondly, and firstly, what are the expectations that would have generated as a result of that?
Firstly, I'll have to say, it's a historic moment for Jamaica, for Dr. Clarke, of course. And I'll start by confessing that I've known him for over 20 years. Many years ago, we served together on the board of the National Commercial Bank, and yes, he's a personal friend. So it's somebody I'm well acquainted with, seeing him at work and socially. I can tell you that he is a brilliant man, and I don't use that term lightly. Highly competent, and based on my own interactions with people in the international community, well respected from he came onto the international stage. So he's not there as a token, he's there on merit, and it's not a job that one applies for. The International Monetary Fund represents virtually every country in the world. Typically it's headed by somebody chosen by the Europeans with a deputy, yes, first among 4 deputies, chosen by the Americans. Currently, the head is European from Bulgaria. Mm-hmm. The deputy is an American of Indian descent. And the 3 other deputies will now be one from Korea, one from Japan, and no one from Jamaica. And, people in a narrow way have been asking the question, what's in it for us?
Yes.
And you have to understand that Dr. Clarke sees himself making a difference, not just on the local scene, but on the global scene, because he has a very, very deep understanding of history and legacy. Remember, he was never in politics, he was plucked from the private sector to become Minister of Finance.
Yes.
He went into a seat to become Minister of Finance. He took a significant pay cut to become Minister of Finance. So those people who are talking about salary, one thing they don't understand is that he would be earning a whole lot more in the private sector, even than this elevated post. I see people saying that he'll be earning over 400,000 US per year.
Yeah, I think they went as far as to say 471,000.
451,000,
yeah,
whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's not about the money. It's just a Jamaican, and you have to understand it. The International Monetary Fund is an agency of the United Nations. I don't think we'd be having the same conversation if a prominent Jamaican went to become the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. Yeah. Or the Deputy Secretary General of UNESCO or the World Health Organization. Wouldn't
it depend on where they're coming from? For example, if they're leaving from either administration in terms of government or from the opposition, whichever. Once they're coming from politics, then you might have that same narrative attending them.
It's unfortunate that politics puts that stigma on anyone. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, we'd have seen commendations and congratulations going to Dr. Clarke from the former Prime Minister, P.J. Patterson, yeah, from the former leader of the opposition and former Minister of Finance, Peter Phillips, because they understand the significance of the development. And they understand that it's not just a recognition of Dr. Clarke's achievement, but also the achievement of Jamaica. Jamaica has, since the fiscal program, achieved something that many 12 years ago in Washington never thought possible. We embarked on something that, and it's a Jamaica program, it's not a Dr. Clarke program. He might have put the icing on the cake. And there is no doubt that his personal involvement on the last lap of the relay is significant, added significant value. And as I say, he must have impressed, because it's not a job you apply for. People touch you on the shoulder and say, are you interested? Yeah. And if you don't answer, it's like you're joining the lodge, you know, you only get one go.
This question is really coming, because I'm going to come back to that particular question though, but I'm looking at it and I'm thinking that Jamaica has been, we're noted for crafting very sound policies, but we are not noted or known for implementing very sound policies. So when you have someone who has the stick-to-itious that Dr. Clarke has, I mean, yes, what's in it for us, but what is it that we're losing now, considering that we might not have another like him for now?
The fact of the matter is that he would have, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn to say this, but he would have also been mindful that such an important program, such an important matter for the country cannot be left to one person. In business, you know, we always have business continuity and succession planning as a part of the risk mitigation in any business. And he would have taken that degree of thinking, certainly to the ministry. And I say, without fear of contradiction, that the Ministry of Finance and the institutions, the regulatory, the legal, and the human capacity to support the program, including the political will in government and opposition around policy continuity, are significantly different today than they were in 2010, 2012, and 2018 when he became minister. Because if we have been tracking the program, it started in 2010 on the Audley Show with the fiscal accountability legislation.
Yes.
It involved the memorandum of understanding where public sector workers in Jamaica took real cuts in their compensation over a decade to make it work, where the private sector forewent interest due on government paper under the national and the Jamaica debt exchanges. So it's an all-in program that involved the workers, capital, and successive political administrations, including spending political capital around a fiscal contraction program. I've mentioned Portia Simpson-Miller had to spend considerable political capital to allow Peter Phillips as Minister of Finance to do what he did. So the compression, and within Dr. Clarke's own cabinet, he would have had detractors to say that the prudence is a little too prudent for political prudence.
Prudence is a little bit too prudent for political prudence.
Of course, he came under tremendous criticism from within, but he had the backing of his prime minister.
So does that though, his whole tenure and what you have just described, that the fact that it spanned two separate political administrations, does that in any way, shape or form point to the growth of our democracy, the fact that we are becoming mature, or that's just a one-in-a-lifetime thing?
No, certainly. Jamaica, and I don't think it gets enough credit, Jamaica has learned through hard experience of how to develop a good social partnership.
That's bitter medicine? That's what?
Bitter experience.
Okay.
Bitter experience allows you now to work out in a peaceful and orderly way, progress forward, so that the bitter medicine goes down a little bit easier.
Yeah.
I mean, there are developments in recent Jamaican history that I don't think we pay sufficient attention to. If we look back to the formation of the Labour Advisory Council in the early 1990s, around 91 or 92, where the three parties could come together. When I say the three parties, Labour, Capital, and government, to work out industrial peace. You realize that Jamaica, despite going through a financial sector crisis, the fiscal consolidation and prudence, has done that without any mass demonstration or strike or social uprising, which has happened in Greece, happened in Chile, happened in every other country that has embarked on a similar program. Because a lot goes on in the background to create peace and order.
Yes. So tell us now about some of the policies that he would have, or policies and initiatives that he would have undertaken during his tenure, and how those would have contributed somewhat to the reduction, especially of Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio during his tenure as finance minister.
If people recall, that coming out of the financial sector meltdown, if we look at the late 90s and you look at any budget, if memory serves, almost 2/3 of our budget was going back to debt servicing.
Yeah.
So there was no money left. A lot of the legacy you see today, whether buildings are not properly maintained, whether hospitals are falling apart, whatever it is, are the legacy of years of neglect because we just never had the fiscal space, and I use that in the common terminology. We just never had the cash.
Is it that we don't have the fiscal space because we have an issue? It seems as though we have an issue in terms of maintaining things.
We do that, that's a separate thing, but in terms of the capital expenditure that's necessary to build a platform for future growth, we spent a lot of time just servicing debt. Because one of the unfortunate consequences of a democracy like ours is that it is much easier to borrow now for goodies so people will feel good now, because maybe it's your children or grandchildren, because you don't face the immediate political consequences of the spending now.
Yeah.
But later down, you have to pay the piper. You have to pay back the widows and orphans whose savings you have spent, who you have borrowed the money from. But we had reached a point in Jamaica where we could borrow no more. It forced prudence. Prudence was forced on Jamaica, But to have a soft landing, as the terminology would have it, it would have required, and it did require, a social contract. It did require public sector workers to say, we will take the hit, we will take the reduction, the real reduction in pay over the next decade. It did take the private sector to say, we will take lower revenues on a government commitment. We lend government the money and you give us X percentage interest. They had to take a cut, and on and on. Everybody was waiting, and it's an all-in Jamaican program that has succeeded.
Definitely. So we're going to our first break. You're watching The Conversation, where I'm here with Mr. Chen, local business mogul and the president of Jamaica Employees Federation. Continue to stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation, where we're looking at the legacy of Dr. Nigel Clarke. So just before the break, we were easing into the whole idea of, well, not just his legacy, but what I wanted to find out, in your opinion, what are some of Dr. Clarke's most successful strategies for promoting economic growth and development in Jamaica?
As I said earlier, the policy around reducing the debt to the GDP ratio, which at the end of the global financial crisis of 2008-2010 was around 140%, and getting it down to where it was today. I can tell you that back in 2010, 2011, 2012, our partners in Washington said it was impossible. Jamaica's targets were overambitious. But here we are today, having made history. But so policy continuity was critical. But let's not forget, too, that under Dr. Clarke's tenure, we had the global pandemic, which was another crisis as severe as the 2008 global financial meltdown. The Caribbean was the most affected region in the world because our dependency as a region on tourism caused us to suffer the biggest hit. And yet still, Jamaica was one of the first countries to experience economic recovery and growth post-pandemic. There are small things that happen.
First country in the Caribbean or globally you're talking? Among the first in the Caribbean and among the first globally. Okay. In fact, even today, some countries have not recovered. Yes. So that is a huge feat in itself. I remember just having a chat with him one day in the midst of the COVID relief, because people tend to forget how quickly the relief packages were designed and implemented back in 2020. And he said it was good luck and bad luck at the same time. Because he had put together a war chest, and I can say a war chest, money to spend on other capital projects, largely coming out of the NROC divestment. Yeah. But
he was forced to spend, I believe, close to 40 billion Jamaican dollars of unplanned spending. And if people recall, during the pandemic, there were some sectors that prospered, even when tourism was down, construction being the chief among them. And if you go back to what created the construction boom in Jamaica, you'll recall several things came into play, not least the lowering of interest rates, which meant that mortgages were more affordable, which meant that the monthly payments now to achieve buying home ownership. And I'm not just talking about the high rises in Kingston 6 and Kingston 8, but the thousands of middle income units that have been built in St. Catherine, St. James, and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that was one. But also significant, he reminded me one day, was the reduction in transactional costs, the reduction in stamp duties on the transfer of titles that created and fomented a building boom. So construction was robust even as tourism had fallen off. So our recovery was not an accidental recovery. It was an alignment of prudent policies that served us well in a time of crisis.
How was his approach, though, to fiscal policy different from other administrations, and what are the implications of that difference in terms of his approach?
Well, the fact of the matter is, the targets never really changed because the MOU was clear around the targets, the arrangements with our multilateral partners, the IMF and so on, in terms of where the debt would reach, where public sector wages as a percentage of GDP would reach. So the targets never really changed. Within targets, though, now, you know, politics is the art of the possible, and then you have different approaches. Him coming from the private sector and very much believing in keeping taxes stable, and you realize that his great boast of no new taxes, not changing tax rates, and in fact dropping taxes on many things, dropping taxes on de minimis, things that were the administrative cost was not worth the revenue. I think if I had to give him an act of, an award for an act of real bravery, it was the public sector reform in terms of compensation reform. And I'll take you back. In 1994, I was at a retreat on the North Coast. Back in those days, they had something called a think tank organized by Oliver Clarke.
Yes.
Then Prime Minister was there, then leader of the opposition, governor of the central bank, all the heads of the private sector. I think I perhaps ended up there by accident because there was a youngster from nowhere that nobody knew. But I sat in the room and I realized that this was one of the points of discussion.
Yes.
That the whole issue of the public sector had become cumbersome, reform was, and I remember Edward Siaga saying
cumbersome
that.
Meaning it was too heavy?
Too many different, not only top heavy, inefficient in terms of structure, compensation. It was just, it just lacked logic because over the years it had been patched up and patched up and patched up, and nobody ever stepped back from it and just said, this is much more efficient. Edward Siaga pointed out at the time, and this is 1994, that this had been attempted since 1979, and he had tried and failed as Minister of Finance and Prime Minister with a huge mandate and huge power, and was unable to do it. So when I realized that Nigel Clarke was foolhardy enough to try it and actually largely succeed at doing it, it's something that had not happened despite the fact that we wanted to do it since independence.
So could that just be a testament to the fact that everyone else was, the time was ripe for that? Because it seemed to me now that you're heading into public-private partnerships, you know, as far as he's concerned, his growth initiatives. Apart from that, is there any other successful collaboration that you can speak to?
Well, the biggest collaboration, of course, is the fiscal program. I mean, the fact that the rest of the world recognizes Jamaica. In fact, if you recall, and it's not because I say so, you know, The Economist wrote a whole article that Europe could learn from Jamaica, you know, around the fiscal program.
So, all right.
And that article was written in 2016, 2017.
Yes.
You can go back to The Economist, you can go to the Wall Street Journal, you can go to the IMF's own comments. And to put the cherry on the cake, the fact that they have asked Nigel Clarke to become a deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund is a sign not only of his own competence, but of the success of Jamaica's program.
So do you think, though, that his macroeconomic policies, if those were good, if those were good policies, and how did they affect specific sectors in terms of growth? For example, tourism. You spoke about construction, but manufacturing and tourism, you think those would have had the intended effects if, you know, looking out or looking in from outside?
The fact of the matter is, the first thing you have to ensure is that you have, the other day I was going, I sat on the executive of the PSOJ back in 2007, 2008, 2009. And the other day I came across some old board minutes. You know what was number one item on the agenda? Macroeconomic instability. Nothing was going to be possible in Jamaica in terms of growth, in terms of people looking at their long-term livelihoods and careers in this country, if we did not have macroeconomic stability. So to ask whether specific things are dealt with in a sort of siloed way ignores the big elephant in the room in this case, which is the first thing you have to get is the macroeconomic right around sustainability. Coming back to government, how can a state survive when the bulk of the greater portion of your tax dollars goes to debt servicing and then the rest goes to wages and nothing goes into capital maintenance or investment? It's just an unsustainable, that's a sure way not to develop a country.
So then that begs the question that we most likely would have to tackle at the end of the break, because we're going to one now. I remember looking in one of the local tabloids and I saw where he was going on a plane and saying, bye, be stable. And it showed, you know, as typical, the bang belly economy and the dollar struggling with a crutch stick. You know,
but you know, even that, what has been the movement in the dollar in the last 3 or 4 years? It has barely moved. I mean, it has been in the 150s now for at least 4 years.
All right, so we're
in terms of percentage, that's less than a % movement.
Yeah, we're going to hold it to that, just that. So continue to stay with us. We are, as we stated earlier, looking at the legacy of Dr. Nigel Clarke as he plans to depart to the International Monetary Fund. Continue to stay with us. When we return, we'll be joined also by Mr. David Mullins. You're watching The Conversation. Welcome back to The Conversation. So we are now joined by Mr. David Mullins, as we stated earlier before the break. So just before we speak back to you, Mr. Chen, let's hear David's take. So, hi David, how are you? Welcome to The Conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being invited.
So firstly, we heard about the recent appointment of our own finance minister, Dr. Nigel Clarke, to the IMF in a particular capacity, the first of its kind from Central America and the Caribbean. What are some of the expectations that you think will definitely attend his recent nomination, and how will that benefit? You know, what's in it for us? That's the question. Primarily.
I figured that's where you were going, and I think it's important to first start with what's in it for him. Right?
Yeah.
As a Jamaican, we have to be proud. As Caribbean people, we need to be proud that one of us can go to essentially the highest possible level you could get in at the IMF or the World Bank. Those top posts are reserved for the US and Europe, as we know. So this is the highest any of us could ever get to. So first of all, hats off to him. Let's celebrate that before we ask what's in it for us.
Yes.
Congratulate him, enjoy that. What I would want to focus on is what he brings to the IMF, right? He's bringing something to them that they need. And it's rare that we get to shape policy from inside the IMF. We've shaped policy from outside, whether this was Michael Manley or Siaga negotiating or Peter Phillips or Audley Shaw. They've all had to shape policy in some way. But you're an outsider negotiating with the IMF. This time, we get somebody inside the IMF who can help to change the way that these people have looked at small island developing states and the way they've looked at low middle income countries.
So let me pick both of your brains now, because I love the fact that he stated what he did. We just saw the devastation of Beryl and Petit Carriacou and Petit Martinique and many other countries. So definitely. So we definitely would have expectations. The fact that he's gonna be there now, what difference do you think it might be able to make with him being at the helm of that particular area, and to help us, seeing that we're extremely vulnerable to those kinds of natural phenomena?
Let me manage expectations a bit. Something happened recently. I was at the Small Island Developing States Conference in Antigua and Barbuda earlier this year. And I sat on a panel around the unique nature of small island developing states and our economies. And what we know today is significantly different from what we knew 10, 20, 30 years ago in terms of how economies behave. If you look at World Bank and IMF orthodoxy going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, their prescriptions are considerably different from they are today. And why I say we have to manage expectations, I was making a point on a panel, and an ambassador from Barbados got up, somebody I knew, and he reminded me that we were having the very same discussion in Samoa in 2014 at the Small Island Developing States Conference. But there had been a shift in the thinking.
Yeah.
It took 10 years to shift the thinking, but there was a significant shift in the thinking because we just kept at it. He was at the conference, I was at the conference in Samoa 10 years ago. Here we are 10 years again. I didn't even know he was at the conference. He just got up to the microphone and said, Wayne, you made that exact point 10 years ago in Samoa. And I said, we just have to keep at it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that we have to keep at it because nobody else is going to make that argument for us. And this is just us as panelists. I mean, I might be minimizing. It might have not been or might have been a coincidence that when I sat on the panel in Samoa in 2014, the deputy head of the IMF was on the same panel. Mm-hmm. The deputy head of the World Bank was on the same panel. Me as a little guy from the Caribbean, and my trade union counterpart, David Mullins, from the Caribbean Conference of Labour. But we were representing small island development states and why it's important for us to be in the conversation. So if Jamaica is expecting Nigel Clarke to go to Washington and just, throw his weight around and we suddenly get some goodies in Jamaica, it does not work like that. Mm. What you have to do is reshape the thinking. There was a time when the one size fits all. It works in a big economy, so it must work in a small island state. It doesn't work. If you listen to the World Bank back in 1996, they'd have said, no, man, you have to break up the transmission grid and give somebody transmission, give somebody distribution, and give some people this. It has not worked.
Yeah. So the nuances are different.
The nuances are different when it comes to small island developing states. And it's the first time in my memory that a small island developing state has been represented at this level at the International Monetary Fund. And the fact is that they themselves want to reform, but when you're in that conversation, when you're in the room with the decision makers, when you're in the room with the big boys and they're talking about Ukraine and talking about the transitional economies in Eastern Europe, who is in there talking for us?
Oh, so that's one of the expectations that is not necessarily
unfolded. You may not see,
but
if people are expecting to get a report. Yeah, you might be expecting to see a report card at the end of 2024 and say, oh, we got this and we got that. It does not work like that.
All right, David, what are your 2 cents to that? What are
I don't know if I can add much more. I was going to say the exact same thing. It is critical, right? It's critical to understand. I've said it so many times. Today's IMF is not my father's IMF. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's not the same. And we're going to now have somebody inside that will help to reshape thinking, not simply as somebody who has come through the IMF system. It's someone that they can say, oh, well, he actually executed. Yeah. And we know how it is. When you've actually done it, people are more likely to listen to you. So he has a track record that he can show them. But not only that, he actually understands economic policy, he understands fiscal policy, and he probably can run rings around everybody else in the IMF when he starts to talk about the way it should work, because Wayne is right. It is not one size fits all. It is not simply take the Chicago School of Economics and bring it to the Caribbean and we should privatize everything and deregulate. Yeah. We have somebody inside who is going to be to have serious credibility, but we need to be careful. He's not there representing Jamaica.
Absolutely.
He's there to work for the IMF, who are his employers, to deliver for them. He's bringing our experience to the table, but he's not there representing Jamaica. We don't have an inside man in the team. Right? So we need to be very careful, and we shouldn't pressure that on him. It's similar to when Barack Obama became president of the United States, first black president of the US, and then he had some people saying, well, what him going to do for black people? He's a president of all Americans, not just black Americans. So Nigel now goes in as Dr. Nigel Clarke. He's not just there as a Jamaican former Minister of Finance trying to get goodies for Jamaica.
Or a Caribbean man.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, though, is that our hopes are not unfounded. It's good to be hopeful. It's good to have hope because takes a wealth of experience to the IMF.
To shift a whole world in a very, not only important, a very influential organization.
So then, all right, so put that one side now. So we can also say we can benefit from the fact that it's going to be it's the long game. It's not the short game.
Always a long game. And if you know Nigel Clarke, always a long game.
Wow. So tell us a little bit now about the tax reforms that he would have undertaken and how some of these tax reforms would have impacted business development and investment, the investment climate in Jamaica. I'll ask from David's perspective because he's outside looking in for the most part, and then I'll want you to chime in because you're inside now. So that's a question for you, David. How were some of the tax reforms that were implemented under his watch? You know, how did that impact the environment, the business environment and investment climate in Jamaica, as far as you're concerned?
I would say, am I really looking in from outside, though?
Well, I mean, you know, and we're talking from the perspective of, you know, Blue Moho Capital being outside of, is a Jamaican company living outside of Jamaica. So it's a diaspora company. Let's call it that.
Well, fair enough. I feel I'm in Jamaica every month for a week,
Yeah.
so I don't feel that I'm looking in from the outside, but I can give some perspective. I mean, for me, I have to be very honest. It honestly, it didn't matter to me who was going to be Minister of Finance and which political party. Right? What was already put in place and passed in law, and then we have EPOC there. EPOC is who I consider that actually handles reform in Jamaica. So we have stability and we have continuity. So for me, it actually didn't matter. What could come across though was how could this person present to the people and explain to them what they're doing, why we're making these adjustments with tax reform, right? We're looking at things, for example, along with real estate and the way that has been positively impacted because of the way we've adjusted that. They finally made some adjustment. I would like to see it move more in terms of what's duty-free when you're coming into Jamaica. Right? I would love to see us do a lot more, though, to reduce tariffs and make it easier. We shouldn't have so much headache importing things into Jamaica. We don't manufacture enough stuff. So more needs to happen. But I think he's done a fairly good job of explaining it to people in a way that, yes, some people still don't fully get it, but he has been more transparent than almost any other Minister of Finance since 1962, based on what I've read. I've not been alive since 1962.
You said almost, though. You said almost.
No, So I definitely am impressed with it. But that's why I'm also confident that once he moves on to the IMF, it will continue, and we'll now have pension reform that is already in the works, and we will see where else Jamaica goes. But I would say the most important thing is getting Jamaica off this gray list, right? Blacklist, gray list, now we're going to be good to go. That is going to be transformational for capital coming into Jamaica, and for those of us outside doing business with Jamaica.
So we just heard from David in terms of how the impact on the business climate, and he stated some of the things that we would have had a discussion about,
that I also stated earlier.
You know, off air as well. And it leaves us to wonder, though, you know, how much more, you know, because those things are going to add to the expectations that we have. Based on what both of you are saying, it seems as though he has been doing an awesome job, and so the expectations will only get better or increase. Now, on another note, though, he's leaving. That post is going to be vacant. I'll ask you, who do you think would be the best fit to replace him?
You're getting me into trouble. I'll say it this way. He was parachuted in from the private sector. People tend to forget that there was no political involvement before 2018 when he was brought in.
Yes.
But I'll say this. He has been in the background for a long time. I don't know if it's public knowledge, but when Andrew Holness first became Prime Minister towards the end of 2011, and he first went to Washington, Nigel Clarke was with him. So Nigel Clarke, officially and unofficially, has been an ambassador, really studying the role and studying the landscape and being an advisor. And so the transition from the private sector into the public sector for a time, because it was always understood that this was not going to be a permanent set. It might have ended more quicker than people expected, because an opportunity came up to have a bigger impact on the global stage. But so he has been auditioning for it for a while. I might differ from David in one aspect. Earlier, I don't know if I was on air or off, and talked about us not understanding the value of social dialogue in Jamaica's successful program.
Yeah.
EPOC is an outgrowth. And you know that EPOC, of course, is a social dialogue institution.
Yes.
With representatives from all sectors, labor, capital, government, and so on and so forth. But EPOC doesn't make policy. EPOC monitors policy. At the end of the day, different ministers had to spend political capital to implement policy. If Peter Phillips did not have the backing of a Portia Simpson Miller, who enjoyed great social capital among the Jamaicans who were most affected by the fiscal compression, he would not have succeeded. And I can tell you, that's an open secret, people within his own party, people within Nigel Clarke's own party, the parliamentary group, they have to go out and face the people when they can't hear why more money can be spent on the here and the now. So you have to expend political capital for the implementation. There are tweaks that Nigel Clarke would have brought. They load taxes on terms of, in a former life I sat on land reform in Jamaica. I chaired a big inter-agency, interministerial body.
Yes.
And one of the studies showed that Jamaica had the highest transactional costs in the world for real estate.
Let me hold you on that point, and we're going to our final break. Continue to stay with us. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back. So. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before the break, we gave you I'm giving you the opportunity now to finish the point that you had started. Land reform, that's where you were.
No, the point is that the transactional costs on transferring title to property in Jamaica were among the highest in the world as a percentage when you added on the different taxes, duties, and so on. And one of the things he did, and I know it was with a lot of consternation among the technocrats, because when you forego revenue in Jamaica, you have to make it up somewhere else.
Yes.
And remember, one of the hallmarks of his tenure in the 6 years he was there was not imposing any new taxes. In fact, removing taxes in many instances. And I think David touched on it earlier, raising the duty threshold for people coming through the airport. It might seem like simple things, but one of the approaches, if you followed his budget presentations over the years, was how do we simplify the system, including public sector compensation, which is huge, something that had been attempted for 60 years and only succeeded in the last few under his tenure. But also, how do you get rid of all the nuisance taxes that annoy investors, local and foreign, because Jamaicans are investors in our own country, that were not worth the administrative costs and made us more investor-friendly. And I think there was a lot of combing through the system to get rid of these, what I call annoying taxes. So it's a combination of things. But the more important thing is to create the momentum, create the capacity within the institution, the Ministry of Finance. I didn't touch on the formalizing of the independence of the central bank. I didn't touch on the Economic Commission. But I also have to comment on the capacity of the ministry itself by the introduction of highly talented personnel, the training, the Marcus Garvey Scholarship. There are just many things that are feeding into a more capacious Ministry of Finance.
But you still haven't said who you think would be the best replacement.
I'm not going to call a name. The fact is that if they, based on precedent, you know, I studied it. The first Minister of Finance I looked at was Donald Sangster, going back to 1953, and I looked at every single Minister of Finance since. And the majority of our Ministers of Finance over the last 70 plus years have been attorneys at law. We have not had a single economist, although he's not an economist.
He's not an economist.
So in terms of academic qualifications, it's a mixed bag out there. I mean, Edward Siago, who some people would rate highly, was a sociologist. Omar Davis, his PhD is in demographics and some offshoots of geography. I'm not saying they didn't do some economics courses. I mean, Noel Nethersole did, after becoming a solicitor, did some economics courses. But the fact is that successful ministers of finance have to understand the big picture. They have to be a quick study, as Nigel Clarke has demonstrably proven. But they also have to have the political will or the backing of those with the political capital to do the hard things. Because the danger in economies and societies like Jamaica is populism. Do the popular thing. You borrow to do what is popular now and pray that you don't pay the political consequences when your grandchildren are paying the debt. Instant gratification. And that is the constant fight.
So, David, so we want to hear your views on that. Who do you think would be a good replacement for Dr. Clarke, and why?
So I'll give you a name, but I won't start with the name. I want to follow up on what Wayne was just saying. And I would start by saying I don't want an economist to be Minister of Finance of any country.
All right, go on.
Right. I don't think economists are the ones that you actually want at that level. You want economists to advise the Minister of Finance. There's a difference between being a technocrat, right? I want a Minister of Finance that has a business track record. They understand how business works because ultimately, government is at its core a business. They need to understand how capital moves, how trade is actually affected, what is comparative advantage. That's not just an economist. I need someone that actually has private sector experience. Unfortunately, in Jamaica, for you to be Minister of Finance, you have to be a member of Parliament, which is why Nigel had to be parachuted into what is unfortunately a garrison community. That needs to change in Jamaica. So we actually need to have some reforms after this.
What do we need to change? The garrison? What do we need to change? The garrison community or
we shouldn't have zones of exclusion. We shouldn't have these places where your political party is guaranteed to win a seat. You shouldn't have that. That's not healthy for democracy.
It should be based on merit.
Right. So you can get the person you want. We all want Nigel as Minister of Finance, and he has to be an MP. So you just give him this constituency and I'm guaranteed to win. So that's interesting. That has to change. So the person has to be an MP or we have to parachute them into that constituency. But they've already given the constituency to somebody. In fact, to the person who had expected to get it the first time. Right? So that means they can't parachute somebody into that one. So it's probably an existing Minister of Finance, member of Parliament. So one option is that you put it under the Prime Minister, right? The Prime Minister already has a lot of stuff, but you could do it. Tiaga did it, and then actually have some technocrats work in there. My preference is that you bring Minister Favour Williams over back to the Ministry of Finance. She's been there before. She actually is a CPA or a CFA. So she has this. I mean, she has the business background, private sector. She has the credentials on the academic side. She's not an economist. She's already in Parliament and she's Minister of Education. I would move her over and I would put somebody else into Ministry of Education. That is what I would recommend.
And you think that would have been that would be a good fit?
I think it would be a great fit based on the fact that she's actually worked in there before. So she's worked in the Ministry of Finance. So she's already familiar with the people there. So you don't have this long period to get up to speed and get to know people. She already know that. She literally is a glove that fits. She just step in, move forward. I think a lot of Jamaicans have been surprised at learning about Favour's academic background. A lot of people did not realize where she went to school, what she studied, and what she's accomplished that way. So I think that would be excellent. She would be, I believe, our first female Minister of Finance as well.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But yeah, I definitely would see her. I think my money would be on her. If I bet, I'm not a betting person. If I was to bet, I would bet on Favour.
So I'm thinking though, Wayne and David, that would definitely be some huge shoes to fill for anyone. Because you're going into expectations. It's not that you have expectations that are following you. You're going into expectations that would have been made. And irrespective of how well you do, you're going to be compared to what he did and what our expectations of him were.
That will always be a difficult one. But I will endorse what David has said certainly in terms of Favour Williams.
So you're giving a name now?
No, I'm only saying that she certainly, I don't want to damn her with faint praise and say she would not be a bad choice. The fact is that she's a highly qualified choice.
Yeah.
But the precedent is also there of parachuting someone in. Whether West Central, St. Andrew is a garrison. It might have garrison elements, but it is a contested seat. It's a seat that people can contest. So the Prime Minister would always have the option of a safe seat, I would choose to call it that going forward, and bringing someone from the private sector. And in that regard, there are many highly qualified people within the private sector that could fill that role.
Definitely. So now tell me about Dr. Clarke's appointment now. How does that position Jamaica, one, and the Caribbean region in terms of global economic discussions and decision-making processes now? We started to hint at it, the fact that we now have a man on the inside. But what are the broader implications for something like that?
I will tell you something. And David probably goes to these conferences where the Latin Americans will caucus the big Latin American countries. And my friends in Argentina, my friends in Brazil will remind you that the entire Caribbean can fit into a suburb of Sao Paulo in terms of economic potential and economic clout and population. So the Caribbean and small island developing states, because I stress the point, because there are unique features of small island developing states that are not shared by continental countries that have borders and countries that, I'll give you a recent one. There has been some orthodox thinking coming out of the World Bank going back to the 1990s about breaking up the electricity grids and breaking up monopolies and so on. Based on the experience in the Dominican Republic, it has been shown not to work, but we were being fed this for a long time. We need people in court who have gone through the experience so we don't have to go through the learning curve. Because unfortunately, the learning curve for countries like Jamaica sets us back for generations.
Yeah.
Well-meaning agencies and consultants and so on come. A friend of mine has a joke, what is a consultant? Somebody who borrows your watch and tells you the time.
Wow.
The fact is that we need people now who have gone through it. Jamaica is a star because we have succeeded when they said we'd fail. I had friends in the IMF a dozen years ago who said what we're embarking on was foolishness. She said to me that the betting between the IDB, the World Bank, and the IMF was Jamaica would not succeed. And we were wasting time. We should just take a haircut, go through financial sector crisis number 2, never mind the suffering of the vulnerable and the poor, and get it behind us in 2 years. Yes, you might have rioting in the street and all of that, but better to take the medicine one time, bitter, and move on. Mm-hmm. Hugely disruptive. What we are going down is foolishness, bound to fail. It's only because we formed the United Front here in Jamaica and said, no, we're going to take the more difficult route. Social dialogue is important. But we need now that experience that we went through in Jamaica to permeate the policies of the big global policymakers. Because we're not normally heard. As I say, Jamaica can fit. Take the whole English-speaking Caribbean and pile Haiti in for good measure. Put the DR in, and we're not even at the GDP or population of Sao Paulo state in Brazil.
What can you add to that, David?
100% agree, right? Our office, our headquarters is in Brickell in Miami. And right now there's a conference coming up, Latin America and Caribbean Forum. I speak at all of these for the last 6 years. The reason I end up getting asked to speak is because I will email them and I say, how dare you host an event claiming it's Latin America and the Caribbean and you have no speakers from the Caribbean. You have nobody talking about investing in the Caribbean or our experience. It's all Latin America. You cannot look at us that way. Either don't include us and we go to our event, or you include us. Don't put our name up there. So Wayne is right. We now have somebody that they have to listen to. But on top of that, there is a case study. You can Google the Jamaica IMF case study. You can look at Jamaica versus Greece and what we have done, and then you get to have a discussion with one of the key architects and people that executed Dr. Nigel Clarke at that point. Yeah. So we have the credibility, we have the track record, and having somebody on the inside now who no longer is going to work for us, he gets to champion the fact that y'all need to think differently, and here's why you need to think differently. You have outdated economists' approach. When you see these population numbers, economists just see numbers. They don't see people, and that is the difference. You need somebody in there that sees the people and say, well, no, we're not going to make them suffer like what happened in the 90s or what happened elsewhere. We are going to actually take the approach of how a sociologist would do it. These are actual people. How do we protect them?
Yeah. All right. So, well, that's all for our conversation for this week. We just want to thank you, Mr. Chen and Mr. Mullins, for joining us on this insightful discussion about Dr. Nigel Clarke's legacy and the implications of his new role at the IMF. It's clear that his contributions as finance minister have had a lasting impact on Jamaica's economy, and his appointment to the IMF is a testament to his leadership and expertise. So we do hope that the next successor will do an amazing job, just as he did, and we wish him all the best on this new journey. Thank you for watching the conversation, and do remember to stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and on X. And join us next week as we explore another pressing issue affecting our region. I'm Kwame Thomas. Take care.